Hi, I'm Rick Sizemore, host of the VR Workforce Studio podcast, with a really important question for you. Is it time for the world to hear your disability employment story as a guest on the VR Workforce Studio podcast? According to the podcast Business Journal, the Vocational Rehabilitation, or VR Workforce Studio podcast, has emerged over the past few years as the nation's voice for sharing powerful and compelling stories of disability employment. So today, I'm going over the top 10 questions that come up over and over again as people consider coming on the show, in hopes that this could help you decide if it's time for the world to hear your vocational rehabilitation story. Starting with question number 1, what is a podcast anyway? Well, I like to think of it as a radio talk show from your phone that you can tune in whenever you want to hear it. Podcasts are generally available on the internet or phone apps and focus on a group of listeners and topics that they're interested in. Question number 2, and I get this question a lot, is the show live? So here's the point where I tell you to just relax. This is all pre-recorded and it will be edited. In other words, if you happen to make a small mistake, it's super easy to fix before it's published. In other words, there's no pressure here. We'll make you sound like a rock star. Question number 3, how is it recorded? Well, sometimes if we happen to be in the same location, I can set up a microphone and record you. But the majority of the time, it's recorded remotely, like most podcasts. In other words, I can record you on anything from your basic cell phone, your computer, even your landline at home if you want. Now, if you happen to have a headset mic like many people use for computer gaming, that's really good. And many times we use that setup to record using Zoom or Skype. Sometimes callers use apps like FaceTime, but let's make this really simple. I'm happy to record you on whatever is easiest for you. Question number 4, how long does it take to record a podcast interview? Well, usually about 15 minutes. The VR Workforce Studio podcast interviews normally run about 10 to 12 minutes. And so if you could set aside, say, 20 minutes from start to finish, that's all it takes. Question number 5, what are the topics covered on the show? Well, the VR Workforce Studio podcast is very, very focused on disability employment and vocational rehabilitation. So the interviews discuss things like your disability, your job, how Voc Rehab may have helped you, and discussion topics about moving into a better life through work because of vocational rehabilitation. We can also discuss any related topics of interest to you. So question number 6, and this is the most popular question I get, hands down. And I get it from almost every guest who is thinking about coming on to the show. Will I get the questions ahead of time? No, not really, because this is a very informal conversation, but we don't stray too far away from the topics that we've already talked about, the disability, the job, how vocational rehabilitation has helped people. And so you can be pretty confident on the kinds of things that we're going to talk about. Question 7, where will the podcast be published? So the podcast will be posted at vrworkforcestudio.com, but then distributed across the internet on something called a really simple subscription or RSS feed, which means it goes a lot of places. For example, you'll find the podcast on popular apps like Apple Podcasts. It'll be in iTunes, on Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, just to mention a few. There are numerous other outlets, including internet radio stations and other broadcast networks as well. So suffice it to say, this thing will go all over the place. Question number 8. Will people be able to contact me if I want them to? Of course. If you'd like to provide a phone number or email, we'll be happy to make that available to listeners in something called show notes, which are part of the web page where the episode is published. Question 9, can I talk about my employer during the interview? Of course, we'd love to hear all the nitty-gritty details about your job and your employer, but make sure you discuss this with your employer before the interview is recorded and get their permission. Last but not least, question number 10. This is a super important topic, and the question is, can I or my employer approve the show before it's published? It's a really good question, one that comes up sometimes. The answer is no. Because of the production process and how we get ready for the show, it's really important for us to all agree on what we're going to talk about and that you trust us to tell your story effectively. But once it's put together, like in most broadcast mediums, it's very difficult to go back and change a production once it's completed. You know, people love what we do with their stories, and they give us very high approval ratings on how we present the background of the story and the deep respect we show for our guests. Again, our goal is to simply showcase the success stories of people with disabilities, the people who work with them, and of course, the businesses who hire them. So, if you'd like to be on the show, just email me, Rick Sizemore, at rick.sizemore@dars.virginia.gov. Or work through your vocational rehabilitation counselor to schedule an interview. People who are on this podcast consistently say they not only enjoy the show, but that sharing their story is important to not only affirm their own success, but to help people with disabilities secure their rightful place in the workforce. Until next time, I'm Rick Sizemore, inviting you to join me as we podcast the sparks that ignite vocational rehabilitation.